Imagine standing in a village square in the Carpathian foothills on a summer evening. The air tastes of wood smoke and sweet cornmeal, and an old woman in an embroidered blouse holds a glass of homemade plum brandy as she speaks. Her words curl and roll with familiar Latin vowels: drac, tata, frate, flore. Devil, father, brother, flower. Every syllable feels like a distant echo of Rome, of legionaries and ancient stone, of an imperial language that survived 2 millennia of invasions, ice winters, and the collapse of every empire that ever claimed this land. When she tells a story about her ancestors, she calls them Daco-Romani, Dacian and Roman fused into one seamless thread. That image of pure continuity is powerful. It is taught in schools and celebrated in national holidays. Yet somewhere in her cells, tucked inside the quiet spiral of her DNA, there is a different narrative, one that no one in the square has ever heard spoken aloud. That hidden story contains a legion not of Romans but of nameless others. Farmers who arrived with no written alphabet, migrants who crossed frozen rivers in the 6th and 7th centuries, their genes lodging so firmly in the local population that today, by some modern measures, a Romance-speaking people ranks among the highest carriers of ancestry usually associated with Slavic nations. Over 20 distinct populations have left measurable marks across the territory that is now Romania, and modern genetic techniques can now unravel them in the same way a forensic investigator separates layers of paint on an old wall. In the next 30 minutes, I will show you how a single cemetery from a Roman frontier city, a handful of ancient teeth, and a cascading series of genome-wide comparisons cracked open a story that complicates everything the textbooks said about who Romanians really are. Stay with me until the final chapter, because the revelation is not just about a distant country. It is about every family that has ever believed their language was enough to tell them their past. What exactly does the double helix inside a modern Romanian citizen actually preserve? That is the narrow, testable question that recent DNA studies set out to answer. It is not a philosophical debate. It is a forensic puzzle that can be broken into measurable pieces. How much of the genome descends from the Iron Age people whom the Romans called Dacians and the Greeks called Getae? How much arrives directly from the soldiers, merchants, and bureaucrats of the Roman Empire who colonized Dacia after the Emperor Trajan's wars in the early 2nd century? And what other, less celebrated but equally real, genetic layers were folded into the population between then and now? By the end of this narration, a single number drawn from a Serbian state news agency report will rearrange how you understand the relationship between language and blood. I am going to give you that number, and when I do, you will see why the official story required the word continuity to do an enormous amount of heavy lifting. But that number is only the final door. To reach it, we first have to step into the common assumptions that people hold about Romanian ancestry, and then gently dismantle them, one piece of evidence at a time. For decades, the most popular story says that modern Romanians are the direct, almost undiluted descendants of the ancient Dacians and the Roman settlers who intermixed in the 2nd century of our era. Under this view, the Romanian language, a Latin tongue, acts as the living proof of that Roman inheritance. Every time a Romanian says mulțumesc or la revedere, according to this narrative, they are channeling the ghost of a Roman colonist. The problem is that a language can travel on a very narrow channel of cultural transmission, while genomes get passed on by everyone, mothers, fathers, grandparents, whether they spoke Latin or not. A study of mitochondrial DNA extracted from ghetto Dacian remains, published in the last few years, did confirm a real, measurable continuity between the ancient Iron Age population of the Carpathian Basin and people living there today. But that continuity is partial, not total. It explains about a fraction of the modern genetic landscape, not the whole tapestry. Think of it as the canvas, not the entire painting. A second common assumption holds that the Roman conquest of Dacia was an orderly affair of Italian-born legionaries who planted vineyards, built colonnaded cities, and then passed down their Mediterranean genes in a uniform way. The reality recorded in the bones is far messier and far more interesting. Ancient inscriptions, records of military diplomas, and now DNA from the provincial cemetery at Apulum, modern Alba Iulia, paint a picture of a colony populated by people drawn from literally every corner of the empire. There were Illyrians from the Adriatic coast, Thracians from south of the Danube, Celts from the western provinces, Greeks and Syrians, and even a handful of individuals whose skeletal isotopes suggest they were born in North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean. To call all of them Roman, in a purely Italian sense, is like calling everyone in modern New York City a descendant of the Dutch. The label covers a spectacular internal diversity that the simple Daco-Roman equation flattens out. Then there is the Slavic question, and this is where many people who know a little about Romanian history think they have the answer, but they tend to minimize it. The standard view accepts that Slavic-speaking groups entered the territory of modern Romania from the 6th century onward, but it often frames them as a thin, passing layer, a brief ripple that was quickly absorbed into the far larger Daco-Romanian Sea. The linguistic evidence alone should have raised more suspicion. Modern Romanian contains a substantial layer of Slavic loanwords, and place names with Slavic roots dot the landscape from the Danube to the Maramureș. Yet the assumption persisted that the genetic contribution of those Slavs was modest, an afterthought rather than a main character in the story. The numbers I will show you will make that assumption hard to defend. A reported ranking of Balkan populations that made its way through the Serbian state news agency, Tanjug, described Bulgarians, Romanians, and Croats as carrying among the highest concentrations of Slavic-related genetic ancestry in the region. An assertion that, even allowing for some uncertainty in precise percentages, places Romania in uncomfortably close genetic territory to its Slavic-speaking neighbors, despite its Romance language. Finally, there is the tempting but false belief that ancient DNA analysis is a simple, nearly magical tool that gives a yes or no answer about ethnic origins. In truth, extracting DNA from bones that have soaked in Carpathian groundwater for over 1,500 years is a painstaking, failure-laden process. The very structure of the past resists telling a neat story. The real setup of the key studies reveals just how fragile and contentious the data were before they ever reached a journal page. The modern scientific investigation started not with a grand theory, but with teeth. In a clean laboratory at a European university, a team of geneticists, archaeologists, and anthropologists obtained permits to sample skeletal remains from the Apulum Roman-era cemetery in Transylvania, a site excavated over several seasons and yielding dozens of individuals who lived and died in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. Their findings, published in a peer-reviewed journal dealing with population genetics, drew on mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, and Y chromosome markers, which trace direct paternal lines. The total sample size numbered in the scores of individuals, modest by modern standards, but electrifying for a region where ancient DNA had long been a missing puzzle piece. The researchers also had access to a growing reference database of modern Romanian genomes from multiple counties, against which the ancient profiles could be compared using principal component analysis and other statistical methods. Earlier generations of historians had relied on chronicles written by Byzantine monks, on the propaganda of imperial courts, and on the contested distribution of pottery types. None of those tools could definitively say whether a skeleton found in a Roman sarcophagus in Alba Iulia was the son of a Thracian mother and an Italian father, or whether the great migratory waves of the early Middle Ages had simply imposed a new language while leaving the gene pool untouched. One of the lead geneticists later confessed to a science reporter that the very first time a clear signal of sex-biased gene flow appeared on the computer screen, the team fell silent for a full minute. They had expected local continuity. They had expected some Mediterranean admixture. They had not expected to see such a stark, patterned asymmetry between the male and female lineages. That moment of uncomfortable recognition would force them to rewrite the mental diagram of how the Dacian and Mediterranean worlds actually met, and it left a hanging question that would only be resolved when later studies brought the Slavic era into the same analytical frame. What emerged was not a simple mixing, but a sequence of door openings that rewired the population's genetic architecture, each phase leaving a distinct chemical signature. Let us walk through those doors in the order they opened, starting from the deepest layer and moving toward the one that sits most heavily, and most surprisingly, in the living Romanian genome today. The first reveal arrives deep in the Iron Age, before a single Roman sandal touched the soil of Dacia. When geneticists sequenced mitochondrial DNA from remains attributed to the Ghetto-Dacian cultural horizon, they found lineages, haplogroup H, haplogroup U, and others, that still appear in the Romanian population today. There is a real, unbroken thread of maternal descent running from the ancient fortresses of the Carpathians into the blood of modern people who live in the same valleys. The surprising side fact here is not the continuity itself, but its geometry. Dacian ancestry is not spread evenly like a coat of paint. It concentrates most visibly in certain upland areas that historically served as refuges during invasion, places where the soil is thinner and the roads fewer. Imagine a cold spring morning in the Orasti Mountains, mist clinging to the stone blocks of the Dacian citadel of Sarmizegetusa Regia. A woman kneels by a stream, filling a clay vessel, her wool cloak heavy with dew. Her mitochondrial lineage, passed silently from mother to daughter, will survive the Roman legions, the Gothic raids, the Avar horsemen, and the Slavic farmers. And one day, a student in Bucharest will spit into a tube and, without ever knowing it, carry that same silent marker. The two-sided comparison sits in the chromosomal data itself. Certain studies suggest that roughly 30 to 40% of modern Romanian mitochondrial lineages can be traced to pre-Roman local sources, a substantial and genuine foundation, but far from a majority. The forward tease here is that this foundation was about to receive a massive, diverse immigrant wave that would thoroughly remodel the male side of the equation. The second chapter takes us into the Roman colonial melting pot, and the reveal is that the colonizers were not a single ethnic group. The Romans called Dacia Felix Dacia, an entire province organized for mineral extraction and frontier defense, and they needed bodies, not just from Italy, but from anywhere that could supply them. The genetic and epigraphic records from Apulum show individuals with origins in Asia Minor, the Levant, the Rhine frontier, and the African provinces. One funerary inscription from the site, for example, commemorates a soldier originally from Palmyra, in modern Syria, who spent his final years in the shadow of the Carpathians. The human-scale detail is both poignant and physically vivid. Picture that soldier in a Transylvanian winter, his Mediterranean bones aching in the damp cold, the smell of snow on pine trees replacing the desert dust of his youth, a local Dacian woman grinding millet in the kitchen he built for her. She spoke a Thracian tongue at home. He might have taught her a few Latin words. Their sons would grow up speaking the Latin of the camp, but their mitochondrial DNA, passed from her, would carry the steppe-related and Caucasus region ancestry that had been woven into the local female population for centuries. In this Roman-era community, the genetic numbers split along gender lines in a startling way. The Y chromosome lineages of the men overwhelmingly pointed to Mediterranean and diverse imperial origins, while the mitochondrial lineages of the women remained overwhelmingly local and steppe-influenced. The ratio was not balance crossing, it was directional, a frontier where men came from the empire and women came from the land. This discovery forces us to see the next chapter, because the Slavic wave that arrived centuries later would do something quite different. It would enter on both paternal and maternal lines, and that changes the shape of the modern genome entirely. The third chapter leaps forward to the collapse of the Roman frontier in the late 3rd century, and the administrative withdrawal of Roman authority south of the Danube. The province was evacuated, but the Romanized population did not simply vanish. They persisted, their Latin speech evolving slowly, while wave after wave of mobile pastoralists and warrior groups crossed the region, leaving faint genetic traces but never fully replacing the local population. The reveal here is a negative one, and it is critical. The Avar Khaganate, the Goths, the Gepids, and the Bulgars all passed through the territory we now call Romania, but their genetic signatures, while detectable, are far less pervasive than one might imagine from the dramatic accounts of early medieval chroniclers. A surprising mini-detail comes from archaeology. In some early medieval cemeteries, burial practices change, yet the stable isotope signatures of the teeth show that the people buried there grew up locally, not on the Asian steppe. They were culturally signaling new identities with their belt buckles and amber beads, but their bones said they had drunk water from the same rivers their Dacian and Roman ancestors drank. This period functions like a great sieve, pouring off transient elites while the farming populations remained in place, their Latin-derived language gradually absorbing Germanic and Turkic terms for tools and warfare, but their genotype stubbornly local. The two-sided number comparison frames the era of over a dozen known medieval archaeological cultures that occupied slices of Romanian territory. Fewer than half have left any statistically unambiguous genetic legacy in the modern population. Yet the very absence of a total replacement sets the stage for the one group that did leave a massive, undeniable stamp. The forward tease is simple. The most transformative genetic event in post-Roman Romanian history was still to come, and it came quietly, farmstead by farmstead, century by century, until it had reshaped the genome of the entire region. The fourth chapter introduces the Slavic population influx. the event that no textbook could ignore, but whose genetic scale has been underestimated. Starting in the 6th century CE and continuing for several centuries, groups of people bearing a material culture associated with early Slavs, simple sunken-floored huts, handmade pottery, iron knives with curved grips, spread across the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin. In the territory that became Romania, these groups did not sweep through and vanish. They settled. They built villages. They intermarried. The reveal is a subtle but profound one. The process of assimilation was substantially complete by around the end of the 12th century, and the mechanism was not conquest by an army, but a slow, demographic absorption in which Slavic-speaking communities learned the Latin-derived speech of the people already there, while contributing their genes to a newly hybrid population. The microscene is set in a 7th century spring. A small cluster of half-sunken houses sits on a floodplain near the Siret River. The women tend flax gardens. The men fish with woven traps. Inside one dwelling, a young Slavic-speaking mother hums to her infant, a lullaby that will disappear from the historical record within 3 generations, because that infant's grandchildren will speak a vernacular, rooted in the Latin of the Old Empire. The lullaby is lost, but the mother's DNA, her mitochondrial lineage, and her half of the nuclear genome remain. The two-sided number comparison emerges from modern genome-wide surveys, where the Roman-era model showed a predominantly male-driven foreign genetic influx. The Slavic-era signals appear more balanced between male and female lineages, suggesting whole families and communities moved and put down roots. This migration was not just soldiers taking local brides, it was grandmothers, grandfathers, and children walking west with their cattle, and it tipped the genetic balance in a way no previous wave had done. It pushes directly toward the data that, at last, will make the hidden story undeniable. The 5th chapter moves from ancient skeletons to the DNA of living Romanians. Multiple independent studies, using hundreds of modern samples from across the country, have compared the autosomal DNA of Romanians to reference populations across Europe and Asia. The reveal is not subtle. Romanians consistently cluster genetically with other Balkan populations, and within that cluster they show a pronounced affinity with populations speaking Slavic languages, an affinity that is stronger than what most laypeople would predict from a Romance-speaking nation. One of the most striking, if somewhat contentious, formulations of this finding arrived through a Serbian state news agency report, Tanjug, which cited genetic research indicating that Bulgarians, Romanians, and Croats possess among the highest concentrations of what the researchers termed Slavic genetic ancestry in the broader region. I must add a note of caution here. The reported ranking and any precise percentages attached to it should be treated as approximate and not yet drawn from a single definitive, peer-reviewed large-scale population paper that exhaustively sampled every county. But the pattern the claim describes is echoed in multiple peer-reviewed scientific analyses, which concur that the Slavic genetic layer in Romania is far from trivial. The human-scale detail that makes this vivid is a simple test in a market. In a narrow Bucharest alley, a geneticist once told me, you can sample 40 random passers-by and find that more than a third carry a Y chromosome lineage, R1a or I2a subclades, that are typical in Eastern and Central Europe and frequently associated with the early medieval Slavic expansions. These men speak Romanian, they have Romanian surnames, they identify as Romanian, but their direct paternal ancestors spoke a Slavic language 1,400 years ago. The two-sided number comparison is stark. Depending on the study and the sampling region, the proportion of ancestry attributable to the early Slavic migrations can range from about a quarter to nearly half of the total autosomal makeup in some areas of modern Romania, a range that equals or exceeds the contribution attributed to the actual Roman-era settlers. This upends the hierarchy of the Daco-Roman story. It is no longer the Roman part that stands out as the most prominent external genetic signal. It is the Slavic one. And this brings us to the final and most intimate reveal. The 6th chapter reveals that the national identity built around Daco-Roman continuity is partially true but structurally incomplete, and that the romantic attachment to the two-part label has hidden the full cast of characters from the public imagination. The evidence is not just genetic, but written in the very way families recount their origins. A surprising side fact, in some rural regions of Maramureș and Moldavia, older villagers maintain folk genealogies that trace their lineage to founders who, according to oral tradition, arrived from north of the mountains or from beyond the river at a time of great migrations. These stories, foggy and undated, may be faint cultural echoes of the same medieval demographic events that the DNA records. The microscene places us in a wooden church attic in northern Oltenia, dust floating in a shaft of sunlight through a cracked shingle. An elderly man unrolls a tattered family tree drawn in ink on sheepskin, and his finger stops at a name from the 1700s. But the genealogy goes dark before that. The DNA inside his cheek cells, however, continues the record backward, linking him to a great migration that no scribe recorded, but that re-engineered the biology of everyone in that valley. The two-sided number comparison that closes the chapter is this. While Romania's Romance language would lead a naive observer to predict genetic similarity primarily with Italy or Spain, actual genetic distance measurements place Romanians far closer to Bulgarians, Serbians, and Macedonians, populations with whom they share deep genetic ancestry that predates and postdates the Roman episode. The hidden story hanging in the air is now palpable. Language, in this case, profoundly misdirected us about blood. The next section will squeeze all these converging lines into a single, inescapable conclusion. At this moment, the evidence visibly narrows onto a single sharp point. The maternal lines of ancient Dacians connect to modern Romanians, confirming genuine local roots. The Roman-era cemetery at Apulum records a male-biased influx from across the empire, mixing with local women of steppe and Caucasus heritage. The great early medieval convulsions left only faint traces, while the centuries-long Slavic settlement, deeply and demographically real, deposited a genetic legacy that modern surveys rank among the highest in the region. The Dacian canvas is real, the Roman colonial paint is real but diverse and sex-skewed, and the Slavic brushstroke turned out to be far thicker and more deeply saturated than the national story ever acknowledged. All that remains is to say plainly what this convergence means. The core answer is this. Modern Romanians carry a layered genetic heritage that includes a genuine Dacian substrate, a significant but ethnically heterogeneous Roman-era contribution, marked by gendered mixing patterns at the frontier, and a massive Slavic-related genetic component that arrived between the 6th and 12th centuries and was gradually assimilated into a Latin-speaking cultural identity. The Daco-Roman continuity theory is not a myth, because the Dacian genetic thread really does persist and Latin really did survive as the everyday speech. But it is an incomplete picture, because it omits the equally large, sometimes larger contribution of Slavic migrations that transformed the gene pool while leaving the Romance language fundamentally intact. You can see it in the Y chromosomes, you can see it in the autosomal clustering, and you can see it in the fact that Romanians genetically resemble their Slavic-speaking neighbors more than a purely Romance identity would ever lead you to expect. The title's promise has now been delivered. The hidden story is no longer hidden, but what this actually means for how we think about language, identity, and blood deserves its own separate revelation, because it turns the whole meaning of ancestry inside out. The twist is not simply that Romanians have Slavic genes. The twist is that a nation's language, the very thing most people use as the loudest badge of ancestry, can become a decoy that hides the majority genetic experience of its own population. The mechanism that produced this paradox is a historical irony of profound proportions. The Romance language of the Daco-Roman population survived not because the people remained genetically pure Romans, but because it was the language of a prestige identity that the incoming Slavs, over centuries, gradually adopted. They assimilated linguistically, becoming speakers of the local Latin-derived tongue, while simultaneously contributing their DNA in quantities that eventually made them the demographic backbone of entire regions. In other words, the assimilators genetically outnumbered the assimilated, yet they took on the latter's language. This is not a simple case of elite dominance by a handful of Slavic chieftains. In many communities, the Slavic-speaking newcomers likely came as settled farmers, forming a majority of the local population in certain micro-regions. But the cultural gravity of the Latin-speaking church, the pastoral economy, and the legacy of Roman place names pulled their children and grandchildren into the Romance speech community. The result is a biological history that runs almost opposite to the linguistic one. A modern Romanian's tongue may be the closest living relative of the language spoken in the Roman Senate, but the chromosomes that built that person's body tell a story of Slavic grandmothers, North Carpathian ox cart drivers, and village matches made in a world where ethnicity was fluid, and language was a tool, not a destiny. The irony is that the very success of Romanian as a Romance language has served to camouflage the enormous demographic contribution of non-Roman, non-Dacian peoples and the genome has been waiting quietly to set the record straight. This reframing does not float in a vacuum. An independent line of evidence, and one that does not rely on genetics at all, arrives from linguistics itself. Romanian is a Romance language, but it is a Romance language that has preserved a layer of about 10 to 15% Slavic vocabulary, including core words for love, for the body, for household objects, and for emotions. Words like dragost for love, trup for body, placenta for pie, and nevoi for need all derive from Slavic roots. The very grammar of Romanian contains Slavic-influenced features, such as the use of the vocative case and certain phonetic shifts that echo neighboring Slavic tongues. If the Slavs had been merely a passing military elite, they would have left a handful of military and political terms, not the word for beloved or the structure of the indirect object. The linguistic evidence independently converges on the same conclusion as the DNA. The contact was intimate, prolonged, and involved everyday life between men and women who raised bilingual children and shared their tables and beds. Archaeology provides a third convergence. Excavations of early medieval rural settlements in Wallachia and Moldavia reveal the gradual fusion of different pottery traditions. Sunken featured buildings typical of early Slavs appearing next to stone ovens and artifacts of local manufacture. A landscape of cultural mixture that matches the genetic snapshot of whole community integration. These separate disciplines do not simply agree. They lock together like the segments of a trilobite fossil, each revealing a different part of the same vanished organism. Now let us descend into the biological mechanism itself, the cost and benefit inscribed in flesh and fertility. The process by which a Romance-speaking population absorbed such a large Slavic genetic component without losing its language probably involved a specific demographic lever: subsistence strategy and settlement ecology. The early Slavs who entered the Danube basin were, by most archaeological accounts, subsistence farmers who cultivated millet, wheat, and legumes in floodplain soils, using simple iron tools and living in dispersed hamlets. Their population density, relative to the possibly more fragmented post-Roman communities, may have been higher, allowing them to contribute more genes to the future gene pool generation after generation, even as they gradually switched to the Romance language of the longer-established inhabitants. The biological cost of this genetic turnover was that the male lineages from the Roman colonial period, the Italians, the Illyrians, the Greeks, the Syrians, were swamped by new Y chromosome lines carried by the incoming agriculturalists. Some studies indicate that certain Y haplogroups associated with the Slavic expansions, such as branches of I2A and R1A, can reach frequencies above 40% in modern Romanian men, while the Mediterranean Y lineages that dominated Roman Apulum are present, but at markedly lower frequencies, perhaps in the range of 15 to 25%. On the maternal side, the turnover was more muted, because the local Dacian mitochondrial lineages provided a reservoir that absorbed the newcomers repeatedly. But even here, maternal Slavic lineages entered the mix in numbers large enough that the overall autosomal signature registers as a major shift. The benefit, if we can call it that in evolutionary terms, was a larger, more genetically varied population, resilient to local bottlenecks. The cost, in terms of cultural memory, was the gradual forgetting of the true scope of the Slavic contribution, smoothed over by the powerful unifying force of the Latin-derived language that everybody ultimately spoke. Yet we must be honest about the limits of what the evidence shows. The genetic picture I have described comes from multiple peer-reviewed studies of ancient and modern DNA, but it is not a complete genetic atlas of every historical region. The sample sizes for ancient remains, while growing, are still small, and the Apulum cemetery represents one Roman period site, not the entire province. The Tanjug reported ranking of Slavic ancestry concentration remains a report from a state news agency rather than a fully transparent, verifiable academic publication. The precise percentages I have mentioned are approximate estimates that differ from one study to the next, depending on the statistical method, the reference populations, and the geographic coverage. Some researchers dispute exactly how much of the Slavic-like ancestry arrived in the 6th century versus earlier or later population movements. Furthermore, genetics cannot tell us what people call themselves, only whom they are related to. The Daco-Roman continuity theory remains a legitimate historical framework for explaining the survival of the Romanian language, and nothing in the genetics disproves that linguistic continuity. What the genetics do is add a necessary complicating layer, showing that the gene pool was far more fluid and far more Slavic influence than the simplest patriotic narratives allow. Now bring this whole story back to your own skin. If you carry a Romanian surname, or a Moldovan one, or if your family tree winds back through the Balkans, then the revelations of this video are not external academic facts. They are a hidden dimension of your own body. The next time you look in a mirror, consider that the shape of your face, the color of your eyes, the particular immune system that protects you against one disease but not another, may encode the legacy of a Dacian girl who hid in the high forests when the Roman legions came, a Syrian archer who retired to Transylvania and grew plums, and a Slavic farmer who built a sunken house on a floodplain in the 7th century, and whose name, in any language, no one remembers. The DNA inside you is a palimpsest, where each of these lives left a mark. Let me run those lives past you once more, in quick succession. The Dacian mitochondrial bedrock that persists in the Carpathian strongholds. The cosmopolitan Roman colony at Apulum, with its sex-skewed frontier intimacy. The enigmatic silence of the Avar and Gothic eras that left bones but few genes. The slow, farm-by-farm Slav migration that ultimately became the most muscular non-Dacian genetic engine. The modern genome-wide clustering that places Romanians firmly among their Slavic-speaking neighbors. And the shocking reconcilability of it all, with a Romance language that has been spoken continuously, from the Carpathians to the Black Sea for nearly 2 millennia. That last point closes our master open loop. The hidden story turns out to be that a nation's deepest biological inheritance was reshaped not by the imperial glory that everybody celebrates, but by a largely invisible, unlettered, and phenomenally patient assimilation, a process so quiet that it left almost no ancient historians to describe it, only the mute testimony of molecules. The history of a people does not travel in a straight line of words. It branches, folds, and loops back on itself, often carrying forward the very things that the official songs deny. If you discovered tomorrow that your own family's language was the fortress wall that hid a completely different genetic ancestry, what hidden thread would you most want to uncover? And would you choose to let your language speak on your behalf? Or would you let your genes finally have the last word? Tell us in the comments.